Your daughter just posted your address online. My coffee mug slipped from my fingers. It hit the kitchen tile with a crack that split the mug in half, spreading brown liquid across the white floor like a warning. I stared at the pieces without moving. Ms. Pratt? The voice on the phone belonged to Officer DeVar Rose. Are you there? I couldn't answer. My throat had closed. We received multiple reports this morning. Your daughter, Linnea Lane, posted on social media claiming you're a predator. She gave out your full address, your phone number. She's telling people to warn the neighborhood. We need you to understand the severity of this situation. The room tilted. I reached for the counter and steadied myself against the edge. 54 years old, never been arrested, never hurt anyone in my entire life. And my own daughter had just painted me as a monster to thousands of strangers. How many people saw it? My voice sounded like someone else's. The post was shared over 8,000 times before we got it removed, but screenshots are already circulating. Your address is out there now, permanently. I sank into the chair beside the broken mug. My hands wouldn't stay still. I twisted my wedding ring on my finger, the same ring I'd worn for 32 years. The same ring that now felt like a lie, like everything in my life had been a lie. This couldn't be happening. Not to me. Not from Linnea. My daughter and I had always been close. When she was born, I held her in the hospital and promised her I would protect her from every possible harm. I meant it with everything in me. I worked as a nurse for 30 years, helping other people's families through their darkest moments, and I brought that same fierce protection home to Linnea every single day. She was a beautiful child, quiet, thoughtful. She loved reading more than anything else in the world. While other kids played outside, Linnea would curl up in the corner of the living room with a book, completely lost in another universe. I encouraged that. I drove her to the library twice a week. I bought her every book she asked for, even when money was tight. I wanted her to have a life full of wonder. Her father, my ex-husband Gregan Simmons, didn't understand her the way I did. He wanted her to be more outgoing, more athletic, more like the other kids. When she was 12, he pushed her to join the soccer team. She hated it. She was miserable every practice. I could see it in her face, the way she'd drag herself to the car, already dreading the next session. After 3 months, I told Gregan she was done. He was furious with me. He said I was coddling her. He said I was making her weak. We divorced when Linnea was 14. Gregan got every other weekend, but he rarely used the time. He'd cancel last minute. Say something came up at work. Linnea would wait by the window on Friday nights, dressed and ready, and I'd watch her face fall when his truck didn't pull into the driveway. By the time she was 16, he'd stopped trying altogether. I never said a bad word about him to her. I wanted her to have a relationship with her father. I wanted her to know that his absence wasn't her fault. I told her he loved her, even when I wasn't sure I believed it myself. I protected her from the full truth of his abandonment because I thought that's what a good mother does. Linnea grew up into a quiet, intelligent young woman. She went to college, got a degree in social work, became the kind of person who actually cared about helping others, just like I did. I was so proud of her, so proud. And then she met Hugon Duncan. I didn't like him from the first moment I saw him. I can't explain exactly why. He was handsome enough, charming. He said all the right things. He asked me about my work as a nurse. He laughed at my jokes. He brought wine to family dinners. But something about him made my skin crawl. Some instinct I couldn't quite name. Linnea was different around him. smaller somehow. She'd always been confident, sure of herself. But when Huan was in the room, she became quieter. She deferred to him. She looked to him for permission before she spoke. I noticed it immediately, but when I tried to talk to her about it, she got defensive. "You don't even know him, Mom," she said. "You're being ridiculous. You're just overprotective like always." Maybe she was right. Maybe I was projecting my fears onto him. Maybe I was being the overbearing mother I'd always tried not to be. They got married 2 years later. I paid for most of the wedding, $30,000. I didn't have that kind of money, but I took out a loan because it was my daughter's special day, and I wanted it to be perfect. Huan's family contributed almost nothing. His parents didn't even come to the rehearsal dinner. Within 6 months of the wedding, Lynella stopped calling me as often. She stopped coming to Sunday dinners. When I called her, Huan would answer and say she was busy. She'd call me back later, but the conversations felt rushed, distant. She'd never mention anything about her life, just surface-level pleasantries before she had to go. I tried to maintain the relationship. I invited them over for holidays. Most of the time, Lynella would make an excuse. Huan had plans. They were going out of town. Something always came up. When they did visit, Huan would sit on my couch and make comments about my house, my job, my life choices. Nothing mean exactly, but everything felt like criticism wrapped in a smile. "You must have spent a fortune on this place," he'd say, looking around my modest 3-bedroom home like it was beneath him. Or, "Nursing is such exhausting work. I'm glad I went into management instead. So much less stressful." Or, "You should really think about updating your kitchen. It's looking pretty dated." Each comment was a small cut. Nothing that would kill you on its own, but enough cuts and you bleed out. I tried to talk to Lynella about it. I tried to ask her if she was happy. She always said yes, but her eyes told a different story. They were the eyes of someone who had learned to disappear. I wanted to grab her and shake her and ask her what had happened to the confident young woman she'd been. I wanted to tell her that she didn't have to shrink herself for any man. But I was afraid. Afraid that if I pushed too hard, she'd pull away completely. Afraid that she'd choose him over me. So I stayed quiet and watched my daughter become someone I didn't recognize. Then, 3 years ago, she stopped calling me altogether. I called her constantly, left voicemails, sent texts. Nothing. Radio silence for weeks. I was terrified something had happened to her. I drove to their house, a sleek modern apartment in the expensive part of town that Huan had insisted on. Lynella answered the door, and my heart nearly stopped. She had a black eye. "What happened?" I pushed past her into the apartment, my nurse's instincts taking over. I was already assessing the injury, the swelling, the angle of it. "Did you fall? Did someone hurt you?" "Mom, you need to leave." Her voice was flat, empty. "Huan doesn't want you here." "I don't care what Huan wants. Let me look at that eye. We need to get you to the hospital. They need to document this. If someone hit you, no one hit me." She wouldn't meet my gaze. "I'm fine. You need to go." "Lynella, talk to me, please. What's going on?" She opened the door wider, a signal for me to leave. "I think you should stop coming here. Stop calling. Just stop." I wanted to argue. I wanted to demand answers. But I could see the fear in her face, the way her body had tensed when I mentioned Huan. I knew that look. I'd seen it on the faces of domestic violence victims in the emergency room. I knew what it meant. So I left. But I didn't stop calling. I called every day for a month. She never answered. Eventually, I stopped calling too. The silence was worse than any argument we'd ever had. I tried to move on with my life. I threw myself into my work. I picked up extra shifts at the hospital. I joined a book club. I went on a few dates with a man named Leavam Fuller, who seemed nice enough, though nothing came of it. I told myself that Linnella was an adult. She had to make her own choices. If she wanted to cut me out of her life, that was her decision. But I never stopped being her mother. I never stopped worrying about her. I never stopped loving her. And then, on a Tuesday morning, Officer DeVar Rose called me to tell me that my daughter had just told thousands of strangers that I was a predator. I didn't leave my house for the first week. I was too afraid. I kept thinking about what Officer Rose had said about my address being out there permanently. I imagined angry strangers showing up at my door. I imagined my neighbors seeing the posts. I imagined them looking at me differently from that moment forward. My best friend, Verena Gilbert, came over the first night. She brought soup and sat with me in the kitchen while I stared at my phone, scrolling through the screenshots people had sent me. The posts had been deleted, but the damage was done. The screenshots lived forever on the internet. In the photos, Linnella looked angry, furious. She was holding a sign that said, "My mother abused me. She's dangerous. Keep her away from children." "What abuse?" Verena asked, reading over my shoulder. "What is she talking about?" "I don't know," I whispered. "I have no idea." But even as I said it, my mind was racing. Was there something I'd done that I'd forgotten about? Some moment in her childhood that she'd interpreted differently than I had? I'd spanked her maybe a handful of times. I'd raised my voice when she was in danger. I'd set boundaries. But abuse? That word didn't fit anything I'd ever done. Unless Huon had convinced her that it did. That thought made my blood run cold. I'd read articles about emotional abuse, about how abusers isolate their victims from their support systems, about how they rewrite history, about how they convince their victims that the people who love them are actually the enemy. "I think Hugon did this," I said to Verena. "I think he convinced her that I hurt her, and she believes it now." "Have you tried calling her, asking her directly?" I'd already tried. The first time I called after seeing the posts, she didn't answer. I left a voicemail. "Linnella, I don't know what's happening, but I need to talk to you. Please call me back. I love you. Whatever this is, we can fix it." She never called back. I tried again the next day. Same result. By the third day, when I called, the phone went straight to a message saying the number had been disconnected. She'd blocked me. I sat on my kitchen floor and cried harder than I had in years. My own daughter had erased me. The next 2 weeks were a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. My neighbors started acting differently around me. Mrs. Colleen O'Brien, who lived next door and had always waved at me in the morning, suddenly wouldn't make eye contact. When I went to the grocery store, people stared. I could see them whispering. A few people actually moved away from me in the checkout line, as if my presence was contagious. I got a call from my employer. The hospital administrator, a woman named Raiya Jacobs, who I'd worked with for 15 years, asked me to come into her office. She was professional but distant. She told me that the hospital had received complaints about me. Parents didn't feel comfortable with me caring for their children. She didn't say the word lawsuit, but I could hear it hanging in the air between us. "I've done nothing wrong," I told her. "My daughter is making false accusations. I don't know why, but I promise you it's not true." "I believe you," Raiya said, but her face told me she didn't. "But we have to take these things seriously. I'm going to need you to take a leave of absence while we sort this out." A leave of absence, which meant no paycheck, which meant I couldn't pay my mortgage, which meant my life was collapsing in real time, and I was powerless to stop it. I hired a lawyer, a woman named Sanaya Perry, who specialized in defamation cases. She was expensive, but I couldn't afford not to hire her. She reviewed the posts and the screenshots and told me that I had a case, that Linaella's accusations were clearly false and could be proven false, that we could sue for damages. "Do you have any documentation?" Sanaya asked. "Any evidence that you never abused her? Medical records? School records? Anything that shows her childhood was normal?" I had everything. Report cards showing she was a straight A student, photos from family vacations, birthday party pictures, years of evidence that she'd been loved and cared for. I brought it all to Sanaya's office in a box. She looked through it carefully, and I could see the sympathy in her face. "This is good," she said. "This helps. But we need to talk to Linaella. We need to understand what she's claiming specifically. Right now, she's been vague. Abuse is a broad term." "We need details." "She won't talk to me," I said. "She's blocked my number. Then we'll serve her with a deposition. She'll have to talk to us then." The deposition was set for 6 weeks later. 6 weeks of waiting. 6 weeks of my life on hold. 6 weeks of lying awake at night, my mind spinning through every possible explanation for what Linaella had done. I tried to go back to work after 2 weeks, but it was impossible. Parents complained when I was assigned to their children. Other nurses avoided me in the break room. I could feel the judgment radiating off them. I lasted 4 days before I took another leave of absence. I spent those weeks researching. I read everything I could find about false accusations, about parental alienation, about emotional abuse and how it creates distorted memories. I read about abusers and how they manipulate their victims' perceptions of reality. Every article I read felt like it was describing Linaella and Hugon's relationship. The isolation from family, the controlling behavior, the way she'd become smaller around him, the sudden accusation that came out of nowhere. But I also read about false memory syndrome, about how people can genuinely believe things happened that didn't actually happen, about how trauma can be implanted through suggestion. I wondered if that's what had happened to my daughter. Had Huon convinced her that I'd hurt her so thoroughly that she now believed it was true? Or was I just making excuses for her? Was I refusing to face the possibility that maybe I had hurt her in ways I didn't even realize? That thought was worse than anything else. That uncertainty, that terrible question mark hanging over everything. The night before the deposition, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about all the ways I might have failed as a mother. I thought about every time I'd raised my voice, every time I'd said no, every time I'd set a boundary. Had any of those moments been abuse? Had I misunderstood the impact of my own actions? I got up at 3 a.m. and went to the kitchen. I made tea and sat at the table with my laptop. I pulled up Linella's social media profile. She hadn't posted anything since the initial accusation, but I could see her old posts. Pictures of her and Hugon. Pictures of them at restaurants and on vacations. Pictures that showed a woman who looked happy, or at least was pretending to be. I clicked through months of photos, searching for some clue about what had gone wrong. And then I found something I'd missed before. A post from 2 years ago, before the accusations. Linaella had written, "Sometimes the people who hurt you the most are the ones you're supposed to trust. Sometimes you don't realize you're being hurt until someone helps you see it." The post had a photo of Linaella and Hugon. She was smiling, but her eyes looked sad. I stared at that post for a long time. Was that about me? Or was it about Hugon, and I was just seeing what I wanted to see. The deposition was held in Sanaya's office. It was a small, sterile room with a long table and a court reporter sitting in the corner, fingers poised over the stenotype machine. Linnea sat across from me, and I hadn't seen her in 3 years. She looked like a stranger. She was thinner than I remembered. Her hair was shorter. She wore expensive clothes that I didn't recognize, and her face was completely blank. She wouldn't look at me. She stared at a point on the wall just above my head. Sanaya started with the basics. "Ms. Lane, you posted on social media that your mother abused you. Can you describe the abuse you experienced?" Linnea's jaw tightened. "She hit me. She yelled at me. She made me feel like I was worthless." "When did this abuse occur?" "Throughout my childhood and into my teenage years." "Can you give me specific examples?" Linnea was quiet for a long moment. "When I was 8, she hit me because I didn't want to go to soccer practice." I opened my mouth to respond, but Sanaya put a hand on my arm. She continued. "Did she hit you with her hand?" "Yes." "How many times?" "Once, on my bottom." "And you experienced this as abusive?" "It was painful. It was humiliating. I was terrified of her after that." I felt like I was watching this from outside my body. That single spanking had happened. I remembered it clearly. She was refusing to get in the car. We were late for practice. She was being defiant, and I'd lost my patience for a moment. I'd given her a single swat on her bottom and told her to get in the car. It had been a normal parenting moment in 1995. Not ideal, but not abuse. But the way Linnea described it, it sounded like I'd beaten her. Sanaya continued asking questions. Linnea described other incidents. Times I'd raised my voice. Times I'd said no to things she wanted. Times I'd set boundaries. She reframed every normal parenting moment as abuse. She made it sound like I'd been cruel and controlling. And then Sanaya asked the question, and from that moment, nothing stayed the same. "Ms. Lane, who helped you come to these realizations about your mother's abuse?" Linnea hesitated, just for a moment, but it was enough. "My therapist," she said. "What's your therapist's name?" "I don't think that's relevant." "Actually, it is relevant. I'd like to speak with your therapist about your treatment." "I'm not comfortable sharing that information." Sanaya pressed. "Has anyone else suggested to you that your mother abused you? Anyone other than your therapist?" Linnea's eyes flicked toward me for just a second, and I saw something there. Fear, shame, guilt. "No," she said, but it was a lie. I could see it written all over her face. After the deposition, Sanaya pulled me aside. "I think I know what's happening," she said. "I've seen this before. Huon Duncan is almost certainly coaching her. He's probably convinced her to see a therapist who validates his narrative. He's isolated her from you, and now he's using her to destroy your reputation." "But why?" I asked. "What does he gain from this?" "Control," Sanaya said simply. "Abusers use false accusations to isolate their victims further. If you're the enemy, then Huon is the only one she can trust. If you're the predator, then she can't reach out to you for help when things get worse." I felt sick. "Can we prove that he's coaching her?" "Maybe. We can subpoena her therapist's records. We can investigate Huon's history. We can look for patterns of behavior. But it's going to take time, and it's going to be expensive." I didn't have time. I didn't have money. I had a mortgage I couldn't pay, and a job I'd been forced to leave, and a reputation that was being destroyed by the minute. "What do I do?" I asked. "We fight," Sanaya said. "We prove this is false, and we make sure Linnea knows that you're fighting for her, not against her." The next 3 months were a blur of legal proceedings and investigations. Sanaya filed a motion to subpoena Linaella's therapist's records. Huon's lawyer fought it viciously. Meanwhile, I started digging into Huon's past. I hired a private investigator named Finan Andrews. He was expensive, but I'd taken out a second mortgage to pay for everything. I was in financial freefall, but I couldn't stop. I had to prove the truth. Finan started looking into Hugon's history. What he found was disturbing. Hugon had been married before. Twice, actually. His first wife had accused him of emotional abuse and gotten a restraining order. His second wife had made similar accusations. Both of them had eventually dropped the charges when they couldn't afford to fight anymore. And both of them had reported that Huon had isolated them from their families. Both of them had described him as controlling and manipulative. Both of them had said that he'd convinced them that their families were the enemy. Finan also found documentation of Hugon's financial control. He'd convinced Linaella to put both their names on her bank accounts. He'd taken out credit cards in her name. He'd essentially stolen her financial independence. I sat in Finan's office and read through the documents with growing horror. This was the man my daughter had married. This was the man who had convinced her that I was a predator. "There's more," Finan said. He slid another folder across his desk. I talked to his first wife. She was willing to give a statement. She said that Hugon did the exact same thing to her. False accusations against her parents, isolation, financial control, the whole pattern. "Can we use this in court?" I asked. "Maybe. It shows a pattern of behavior. It suggests that this is his MO, but it doesn't directly prove that he coached Linaella. We still need more." The breakthrough came from an unexpected place. Linaella's therapist, Dr. Levson Crawford, had initially refused to release her records. But when Sanaya explained the situation, that Linaella's accusations were being used as a tool of abuse, something shifted. Dr. Crawford agreed to meet with us. We sat in her office, and she was careful about what she could and couldn't say due to confidentiality. But she said enough. I became concerned about Linaella's narrative fairly quickly. Dr. Crawford said. She came to me with very specific accusations, but when I tried to explore them in detail, the memories became vague. They shifted. When I asked her to describe what happened, she would often repeat phrases that didn't sound like her own words. "What do you mean?" Sanaya asked. "I mean, they sounded like someone else had written them for her, like she was reciting a script." When I gently challenged her on some of the details, she became defensive and said her husband had told her that was what abuse sounded like. My heart was pounding. "Did you tell her that you were concerned?" "I did. I suggested that she might benefit from individual therapy sessions, separate from her husband's influence. She refused. She said her husband needed to be involved in everything because he was her support system." "Did you document this?" Sanaya asked. "I did. I noted in her file that I was concerned about potential coaching and that the patient seemed resistant to exploring her own memories independently. I also noted that the patient had mentioned her husband had suggested she find a therapist who specialized in childhood trauma, even though she hadn't mentioned any specific traumatic events prior to that suggestion. It was exactly what we needed. It was proof that Hugon had orchestrated this entire thing. He'd suggested she find a therapist. He'd coached her on what to say. He'd used false accusations to isolate her further. Armed with this information, Sanaya filed a motion to have the case dismissed. She argued that the accusations were not credible, that they'd been fabricated under the influence of an abusive partner, and that continuing to pursue them would constitute harassment. Hugon's lawyer fought it. He argued that Linaella had the right to make accusations against her mother, that a therapist's concerns about coaching didn't prove coaching had occurred, that this was all an attempt to silence a victim. But the judge saw through it. At the hearing, She listened to all the evidence, and then she made a ruling that was both vindication and heartbreak. The court finds that the accusations against Miss Pratt are not credible, the judge said. The evidence suggests that Ms. Lane was coached to make these accusations by her husband as part of a pattern of emotional abuse and control. The court finds that continuing to allow these accusations to stand would constitute harassment of Ms. Pratt and would further enable Mr. Duncan's abuse of Ms. Lane. The judge ordered the posts to be permanently removed from social media. She ordered Huon to pay my legal fees. She ordered that any mention of these accusations be struck from the public record. But she couldn't undo the damage. I didn't feel victorious. I felt devastated. Because winning this case didn't bring my daughter back. It didn't undo the 3 years she'd spent isolated from me. It didn't fix the fact that she'd been manipulated into becoming a weapon against me. I tried calling her again after the judgment. The number was still disconnected. I sent her a letter. I told her that I loved her. I told her that I knew what Hugon had done. I told her that I was there for her whenever she was ready to come home. She never responded. The months after the judgment were strange and disorienting. My reputation slowly started to recover. The hospital called me back to work. My neighbors stopped avoiding me. Life returned to something resembling normal. But I wasn't normal. I was broken in a way I didn't know how to fix. I went to therapy. A therapist named Norlin Scott, who specialized in family trauma. I told her everything, and she listened without judgment. She helped me understand that I hadn't failed as a mother, that I'd done everything right, and that sometimes that's not enough to protect your children from the people who want to hurt them. You can't control what other people do, Norlin told me. You can only control how you respond. And you responded by fighting for the truth. That's what a good mother does. But knowing that intellectually didn't stop the pain. I started keeping a journal. Every day, I'd write a letter to Lynayella. I'd tell her about my day. I'd tell her that I loved her. I'd tell her that whenever she was ready, I was ready to listen. I filled notebook after notebook with letters she would never read. I joined a support group for parents of estranged adult children. I sat in a circle with other people who'd been cut off by their kids, and I listened to their stories. Some of them had been estranged for decades. Some of them had never reconciled with their children. The pain in that room was palpable. It was the pain of love that had nowhere to go. 6 months after the judgment, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. My heart stopped. Ms. Pratt? A woman's voice, not Lynella's. Yes? This is Detective Asen Baker. I'm calling about Hugon Duncan. We've received a report of domestic violence. The victim is requesting your contact information. My hands went cold. What happened? Is Lynayella okay? I'm not at liberty to discuss the victim's identity, but I can tell you that we're building a case against Mr. Duncan. If you're willing to testify about the pattern of behavior you've documented, it could be helpful. I'll testify to anything, I said immediately. What do I need to do? The trial took place 14 months after Lynella's initial accusations against me. Hugon was charged with domestic assault, financial abuse, and emotional abuse. The victim was Lynayella. She'd finally left him. I didn't know the full story of what had happened. The prosecutor, a woman named Giliora Hudson, wouldn't give me details, but she did tell me that Lynella had reached out to a domestic violence hotline and that they'd helped her escape. I testified about the pattern of behavior I'd witnessed. I talked about how Hugon had isolated Lynella from me. I talked about the false accusations. I talked about the evidence that he'd coached her. I talked about his history with his previous wives. When I was done testifying, I stepped down from the stand and looked into the gallery. Lynella was sitting there, and our eyes met for the first time in 4 years. She was crying. After the testimony, she approached me in the hallway. We stood there, separated by a few feet, and neither of us knew what to say. "I'm sorry," she finally whispered. "I'm so sorry, Mom." I crossed the distance between us and pulled her into my arms. She collapsed against me, and we both cried. Years of pain and separation and misunderstanding poured out of us in that moment. "I'm sorry too," I told her. "I'm sorry I didn't protect you from him. I'm sorry I let him isolate you." "It wasn't your fault," she said. "I know that now. He convinced me that you were the enemy. He made me believe things that weren't true. And I was so afraid to question him because I thought if I did, he'd leave me." We talked in that hallway for hours. She told me everything, how Huon had slowly convinced her that I was controlling and toxic, how he'd suggested therapy as a way to process her trauma, how he'd coached her on what to say, how the accusations had felt real to her, even though they weren't, because she'd been so deep in the manipulation that she couldn't see it anymore. She also told me about the financial abuse, how he'd stolen over $80,000 from her, how he'd taken out credit cards in her name, how she'd discovered it only when she tried to leave and realized she had no money and terrible credit. "I didn't have anywhere to go," she said. "I called the domestic violence hotline, and they helped me get to a shelter. They helped me file for divorce. They helped me understand what he'd done to me." "Why didn't you call me?" I asked. "Because I was ashamed. I'd accused you of the most terrible things. I was terrified that you wouldn't forgive me. I thought you'd hate me." "I could never hate you," I said. "You're my daughter. You were being abused. That wasn't your fault." Huon was convicted and sentenced to 4 years in prison. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Linnella got a restraining order. She filed for divorce. She started rebuilding her life. And slowly, gradually, we rebuilt our relationship. It wasn't easy. There was still pain. There was still the question of how she could have believed those things about me, even if she'd been manipulated. But we worked through it. We went to therapy together. We talked about what had happened. We talked about how to move forward. 2 years later, I stood in my kitchen and made coffee. Linnella was asleep in the guest bedroom. She'd come to stay with me for the weekend. We did that regularly now. She'd moved to a new city, started a new job, started a new life. She was rebuilding herself from the ground up. She'd also started a blog about her experience with Huon. She talked about emotional abuse, about financial control, about how abusers isolate their victims, about how false accusations are sometimes a tool of abuse. She was using her pain to help other people recognize the signs of abuse in their own relationships. I read her blog posts, and I was so proud of her. She'd taken the worst experience of her life and turned it into something that could help others. The coffee finished brewing. I poured 2 cups and set them on the table. Linnella came downstairs, and we sat together in the morning light, drinking our coffee and talking about nothing important. Just enjoying each other's company. Just being mother and daughter again. I thought about the woman I'd been when Officer Devar Rose called me that morning. The woman who'd had her entire life turned upside down by a lie. The woman who'd lost her job and her reputation and her daughter all in one day. That woman had been devastated, but she'd also been strong. She'd fought for the truth. She'd refused to accept the narrative that had been imposed on her. She'd kept loving her daughter, even when her daughter was accusing her of the worst things imaginable. And in the end, that love had been enough. Not enough to undo the damage. Not enough to get back the years that were lost. But enough to rebuild something. Enough to find a way forward. I reached across the table and took Linella's hand. She squeezed back. I love you, I said. I love you too, Mom, she replied, and for the first time in years, I believed that everything might actually be okay. If you're experiencing emotional abuse or false accusations, reach out to a professional who can help you navigate the truth. Subscribe for the next chapter. It's worth it.